Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Hello and welcome to the first of what we hope will be a series of roundtable conversations rather than discussions on the state of the civil services and administrative reforms. We are very fortunate to have with us in the studio today two of India's best known former civil servants. We are joined by a former Director General of Doordarshan, a former Secretary in the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, but of course a man who was much more than all of that, Bhaskar, who joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1960. And we're also very fortunate to have making, I think, his third appearance on Roundtable, one of the best known, if not the single best known, former member of the Indian Foreign Service, Shankar Aiyar, who joined the IFS in 1963. Bhaskar, let's start with you. When you joined the government in 1960, government service was viewed somewhat differently than it is today. If you were speaking to somebody who was joining the IAS or even taking the exam this year, what advice would you give him?
Not to give it.
Not to give it?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I mean, this isn't a service which I think really has the kind of, the kind of mission or the capability which it had when we joined. It's the process of governance has been handed over to other people, and I don't think that it's worth going there merely to become a courtier and to practice one's skills at smarming up to ministers.
You feel that strongly?
Of course.
Really?
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't advise anybody to enter the civil service now, and I doubt whether anyone I would advise to enter would actually enter. In my day, from St. Stephen's College, as Bhaskar is, and I think out of the first 100 in my batch, 25 were from St. Stephen's. This time round, my daughters are there at St. Stephen's now.
Yeah.
I don't know of any single one of their friends who has the least intention of joining the civil service. It's been a complete change in the ethos. It really mattered to be a civil servant then, because I think, as Bhaskar said, you regarded yourself as part of the apparatus of governance. Now you know that not only are you devalued as an individual in the civil service, but the civil service is no longer a delivery mechanism for good governance. That's why I wouldn't recommend that a bright person go into the civil service.
One view is that what you say is definitely true of the IAS, but because the Foreign Service is out of the purview, so as to speak, of Indian politicians, it's relatively immune to this kind of pressure?
It's certainly immune from the kind of pressures to which the IAS is subjected. But the fact is that when the Foreign Service was constituted in 1948, about 3/4 of the postings abroad were in places where it was more comfortable to live than in Delhi. Now it's got totally reversed, and 3/4 of the postings abroad are in places where it's much less comfortable to live than to live in Delhi. So the attractions of being in the Foreign Service are no longer what they used to be. The challenges are perhaps even greater, but there is a very small number of countries where the Indian presence really matters. And therefore, most Foreign Service officers spend most of their lives in irrelevant postings irrelevant to India's destiny, and in conditions that are not comparable to, in terms of comfort, to living even in Delhi. And therefore, it is almost impossible now to persuade people who come high up on the civil services merit list to actually go into the Foreign Service. I stood 7th in the overall list when I appeared for the exam. And I was 5th in the Foreign Service because 5 out of the first 7 wished to join the Foreign Service. Now you're lucky if number 600 agrees to go into the Foreign Service. So I think the time has come to totally merge the IAS with the IFS. And to have a system where you have a single civil service which mans our posts abroad and mans them here in India. And the only difference could be that those who want to be in the so-called Foreign Service stream might perhaps spend a rather larger part of their career abroad and a smaller part of their career in India, and vice versa for those who prefer the IAS stream. But until we merge these two services into a single one, I don't think we're going to get an effective foreign service for today's foreign policy objectives.
Moving away slightly from that, you spoke about smarming up to ministers, about the pressures civil servants are subject to. Can you expand on that?
Well, you see, when I joined the service, there was a certain very clear relationship between the minister and the civil servant. We noticed it when we were junior officers. It was something we took for granted. There were certain things that a minister would not do. And there were certain...
Give me an instance.
Well, for example, I'll tell you an incident which I saw happen at one point. This may not be totally to the credit of the civil service, but still it indicates the kind of relationship that there was. The Arms Act, under the Arms Act, an SDO could issue a license for a weapon of a particular kind. And the minister, the then minister in Dr. Roy's cabinet, Ghose, the late Tarunkanti Ghosh, he recommended that somebody be issued a license to the Deputy Commissioner actually of Darjeeling, who very politely told him a number of reasons why he shouldn't be issued to that particular person, and very gently also told him that it wasn't for the minister really to recommend such cases. It's a question of the Arms Act, you see, sir, and so on. And the minister suitably overawed said, yes, yes, of course, that's quite right, and so on. Do whatever you think is best, and so on. It happened that 2 days later in Darjeeling, Tarunkanti Ghosh was there, and so was the Chief Secretary, Mr. R. Gupta, an ICS officer. And he called the Deputy Commissioner over, Mr. Gupta did, and he told him that, I say, here, get this license issued to this person, first-class chap, known him for the last 15 years. So, yes, I'll have it done tomorrow. Tarunkanti then tapped him on the shoulder and said, just a minute, 2 days ago you told me why I couldn't recommend something. What about this? And the Deputy Commissioner very straight just told him, he said, that's a different matter. You happen to be a minister, he is the head of the civil service. It was taken for granted, and you should have seen Tarunkanti's face, but he accepted it. What I mean is that there are certain things that we knew that the civil service could do.
The Chief Secretary wasn't transferred, the Commissioner wasn't
nothing,
suspended or whatever.
But they began to feel their oaths some years down the line. And I think the power of money, the power of being able to move officers against which they could do nothing. The indignation soon gave way to alarm to despondency, and despondency to the smarming up, as I said.
But Bhaskar, they always had the power to transfer officers.
They always did.
There was always the lure of money.
Yes, yes.
Yet it seems to have started working about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. When is the turning point?
You know, I think it was as you went along a little bit into the 60s, we had a kind of experiment in various, it started in the States incidentally. It was last in the center. Basically the States, they began to discover that it was easy to move officers. And there was no reaction.
When do you date this to?
This would be around, I'd say around the 60s, the late 60s, it would start around that time. And it didn't really affect the center for some time after that. It began when the pressures from other places. You see, what happened was in the political system, as Manu known you too well, the power bases moved to certain states, and it was not so evident earlier. Maybe that was one of the reasons, I don't know. But certainly that was a factor which led the center into becoming, to an extent, and even today I'd say this, that I don't think it's nearly as bad here in the center that in the state. I mean, you don't have things like the former chief minister or mistress, is it, of UP, transferring one officer 7 times in a week or something like that. And she suspended a collector for not having spent the money allotted to him when the fellow had been there under her orders in that post for less than 48 hours.
So what you're saying is, though you're not saying it, you're suggesting, is that a sort of cowbelt sensibility has gradually crept to the center?
Yes, I would say definitely that things are not nearly as bad as it is in the south as it is in this area, because the Karnataka, the administration, I mean, the civil service, let's say the culture is less affected. Tamil Nadu, Mani would know better than I would, but I know that in some of these states, Andhra Pradesh, for example, whatever happened, the thing is that they've kept a certain manner of functioning, which is there.
What about Bengal, which is your card?
Well, Bengal, they've not allowed it to exist. It went away, as I say, in the mid-60s, about that time when you had a successively timorous Congress governments, followed by that dreadful United Front, the first one, and then
Ajoy Mukherjee.
That's right, and then the second United Front, and then of course the Left Front, and in the process they are very, very efficient. They've knocked the bottom out of the civil service. So I mean, the basic thing that a civil servant would have, that is motivation, is not there anymore. Yeah.
What he's suggesting, Mani, is that there are very few states, probably most of them in the south, where the civil service has maintained a certain standard. Is that fair?
I'm more familiar with Tamil Nadu than other states of the south, and I think it's much worse in Tamil Nadu
Really?
than
Give
it
us
is
an
in the
instance.
north. Well, right through Jayalalitha's period, we see that civil servants were active collaborators in the most vicious acts of corruption. Certainly, I saw with my own eyes the way in which 4 successive collectors in a period of 4 years in a newly created district, created after I was elected, who had nothing very wrong with them personally, were being constrained by a political system which simply decreed that the primary function of a collector is to be the protocol officer. The collector spent more of his time looking after SUSU facilities for the visiting minister than he did for any other single thing. In any case, tasks of governance have become so much more complex, so much more varied than they were in the 1950s, when Bhaskar and I sort of saw our superiors and wished to become their peers. That in fact, I think the basic problem is that the reach of the civil service has become much longer than its grasp. In fact, this is true of the entire polity. I think we have stretched the need to govern well beyond our capabilities of governance. And as this gap has grown, and it has grown much more rapidly in the 70s and 80s than it did in the 50s and 60s, the civil service has had to get co-opted into a polity which decided that since policy objectives cannot be attained, well, partisan objectives, let's get them attained. There is no sense in which a collector any longer feels that he'll actually be able to achieve something, however good he may be. It seems too difficult to achieve something within your own time. And when I read Philip Mason's The Guardians and look at the kind of life or the kind of objectives which a British civil servant placed for himself and actually succeeded in accomplishing, one sees that today's collector is a very, very pale imitation. All that he has is the same daftari, with the same sort of livery on. But apart from that, it's all deteriorated.
It's, I think, isn't it time to look at the institutions once again and determine whether or not institutions like the collector, or even for that matter a service like the IAS, needs to be continued or not. I mean, maybe today it's not going to be relevant anymore, because as Mani very rightly says, the task of governance is now so complicated, so big, so varied. I don't think a single civil service like that really is going to help. And it's all very well to talk about the French system of doing things and so on. We're not really in that. We're too varied and too big, too complex. We need to really look at our administration, make way perhaps for specializations in different fields, which could be done by maybe reworking the exam a bit, so that you have different specializations coming out, maybe the same terms and conditions, but is all in all service. And within that, such institutions like the collector, I think, are becoming a little bit of an anomaly today.
I would go much further than Bhaskar.
What would you do?
I think the collector is now Jurassic Park. I think the IAS is Jurassic Park.
Right.
We need to convert the IAS into a secretariat service. This will give us two major advantages. One, it will bring the generalist civil servant back to where he wants to go anyway. In British days, if you read Philip Mason again, the civil service fell into two broad categories. The field officers, who retired as district magistrates and the secretariat wallahs who spend their time sucking up to the viceroy in Shimla. And the field officer looked down upon the secretariat officer, and the secretariat officer looked down upon the field officer. But the result was that you had a system where there was real seniority experience in the field matching whatever seniority and experience there was in the secretariat. Now the single biggest desire of an SDO is to get the hell out and to go back to get into the secretariat. And there is a system by which you can do it. If you get married to a deputy secretary's daughter, you might find yourself coming to a nice district. To a joint secretary's daughter, you get posted to the state headquarters. And if you manage to marry the cabinet secretary's daughter, you can even get yourself a posting abroad. And this kind of a system where the civil servants themselves want to be in the secretariat should, I think, be encouraged, because you can immediately then slash the size of the IAS. And if you slash the size of the IAS, you can then increase the salaries and make it therefore a respectable profession to be in. But then you will say, what of the districts?
But who would want to serve in the districts then?
There I think it is not only desirable but essential that the IAS be taken out of the district, and that we have a series of district administrative services who function under the Zilla Parishad, under the Panchayat Samiti, under the village panchayats, where the typical career pattern is that you begin as the secretary to the Gram Panchayat and you end your service as the chief executive officer of the Zilla Parishad. Then you will have a civil service at the district level, which in social terms does not feel itself superior to the elected representatives of the people, which is comfortable working with the elected representatives of the people, which can create a new ethos in which it regards itself as subordinate to the elected will, and gets sufficiently familiar with that district over a 35-year career pattern, where it can actually say that, let's do this, and has an institutional memory, knows where Sirkari is and where Tarangambadi is. I found my collectors couldn't get to know their districts because they have been transferred. Now here, if you had the system, you can't transfer a man very far from his home, because his home will always be within the district in which he becomes a district administrative officer. And therefore, many of the evils that we have at the district and sub-district level can be removed, one. Secondly, we can have a more contented, because it's a leaner civil service in the secretariats, in state capitals and in Delhi. And similar pairing if you do away with a multiplicity of services, have a single service which is manned by a few number of people, but drawn from a variety of disciplines so as to bring about the kind of specialization that Bhaskar was talking of. I think we could perhaps end up restoring real prestige and real governance to such a civil service.
Slightly different angle. You've served in many ministries. You've been culture secretary. You were in charge of Kashmir at one stage in the VP Singh government. But I suspect most people will remember you for what you did with television. When you went back as minister, as secretary in the INB ministry, because you'd been DG of DD, you understood what it was all about. You knew how to cope with an environment where the television world was changing, where satellite channels were coming in. Extending that parallel to other professions, many people suggest that what we need in India is something like the British pattern, whereby you have a generalist civil service. But once a chap joins a ministry, he stays with that ministry till he retires. Do you think that's a good idea?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I agree with what Pani said entirely on this score, that if it's a secretariat-oriented service, then a person after the exam is allotted to a particular ministry. That's why if you could work the specializations out like that. So he grows within that. So at the end of the day, when he's reached the top of he really has a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge of the kind of work that this ministry would be doing. And he serves as a factor for continuity, which there isn't any at the moment. At all.
Ministers change, secretaries change,
everybody changes, and
JSs change,
and now even even down the line they change. So there isn't any kind of body of acquired wisdom which comes through the years, which is important. So that would be absolutely essential, I think.
We talked about two different things. One is reforming the civil services to be more in tune with India's needs, and the other thing, which I suspect will stay true even if you reform the system, is the attitude politicians have towards administrators. Isn't there some responsibility on the part of civil servants as well? Aren't they only too willing to crawl when they should bend?
Of course. That's the trouble. That's been the case. We read every day of what's been happening, as Mani said. Just look at the situation in Tamil Nadu, the number of senior officers who've been arrested. Look at the situation here. Look at the situation in some other states. I mean, it seems it's very sad that we get more and more officers who are being subjected to and succumbing to the kind of pressures that fortunately one can say that maybe there aren't that many yet, but it's still a frighteningly large number.
Would you accept that the civil service in large part has itself to blame for all of this?
Not only that, they don't seem to want to do anything about it themselves. I've brought with me here the recommendations of this Conference of Chief Secretaries held on the 20th of November 1996, just the other day. And it's pathetic that having correctly identified the problem with regard to themselves, which is that they are, I quote, apathetic, insensitive, dilatory, corrupt, discriminatory. I mean, I couldn't have put it better myself. These are their own words. They end up then saying that what we need is easy access to all information relating to government operations, and that it is necessary to devise systems to break the nexus between politicians, bureaucrats and criminals, which has developed in a number of places. Who better to devise systems than the chief secretaries? But they don't think it's their responsibility. It's become a question of no one wants to know who's going to bell the cat. They all think that by using Americanisms, and this document is horrifyingly full of Americanisms, they talk of right-sizing the civil service, which means bringing it down to the right size. They keep using expressions, that are just, they talk of stakeholders in civic society, but they are not able to say what steps should be taken to break this nexus. And if they themselves don't know what steps to take, who else can tell them which are the steps to take? And they end up with this comical suggestion that there should be a charter of rights in which it should be agreed that the loyalty of public servants should be only to the service for the public and the rule of law. This has been there all the time.
Of course. And this is not a new development.
This is not a new development. And if this is the level at which the intellectual abilities of the civil service are operating, I think you can only say that it's really time to wind up the IAS and get on with a completely different system.
Yes, well, I mean, I can't tell you the kind of discussions that take place sometimes in the cabinet secretariat, but I mean, I've been sitting in on some of these, and I've kept absolutely quiet because it's been astounding, the things that have been said. That kind of stuff. That kind of stuff.
And this is true.
The classic example of stating the problem, which they do, and then bringing in some absolutely irrelevant and piddling little things and saying that these are the answers. Knowing what the right answers are, but they will not say it.
Why?
Lest you say you said it.
Oh, I see.
It's a lack of this
backbone.
It's all gone. We should say that it wasn't the backbone, but I'll say for this program we'll call it the backbone. That there was a certain officer who used to come in every morning. He was working with the governor, and his backbone would be removed and kept in the safe. And the governor would give it back to him at 5 o'clock when he went home.
I don't think it was the backbone.
It was not.
I think we'll stick with backbone
Yeah,
for
we'll
the
stick with the
purposes of television. Listen, both of you are so gloomy.
No,
Unrelievable.
No, I'm not gloomy at all.
You're gloomy about this system.
No, I'm simply saying that Bhaskar and I, in a way, blew it. We joined the civil service at the wrong time. We imagined that the civil service 1960 to 1990 would be the civil service of 1930 to 1960. It was a time of change, but it was a time of deterioration. And now that we are, well, he's actually retired, and I would have had only another year or so in the civil service had I remained in the service. So we've come to the tea time of our lives, if not the evening. And I would say that provided you totally, radically alter the structure of the civil service and the purposes of the civil service, we can still achieve in the next 30 years what Bhaskar and I thought we would achieve in our 30 years, but didn't get.
Exactly.
I personally say the biggest mistake we made at independence was to imagine that a structure of the civil service that had been devised by the British for colonial rule was the appropriate one for independent India. We really should have totally rethought the method of running our civil service.
Absolutely right. You see, that system was designed to rule. Civil servants didn't rule from August 1947, and yet the system sort of impelled them along lines which therefore led to much trauma, and at the end of it, it just collapsed. So all we're saying is not that it's a despondency and gloom, but they change it. But
But
there's
you're
a lot
saying
of very, very
you're saying
dynamic
it needs
things.
radical surgery.
It does.
Otherwise, no.
It does. because
Otherwise,
I
you're not pessimistic. Otherwise, you're
not
pessimistic.
at all. No. If this is changed and brought in, there is no question that if you make it a relevant administration or a structure of government, it's going to be extremely good. I mean, it's got to respond to people's needs. The people are there. Some of the people coming in will be very talented, very bright. They still are. But you can't
your
work in the
basic
system.
position is still the same, which is that unless you do radical surgery and perhaps rethink the whole civil service, we're in trouble.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh, we're in very bad trouble. If we persist with this system, it's going to get worse and worse. There must be such a radical overhauling.
Take the example, Mani, of the power situation in Delhi. Look at what's been going on. This
Oh,
is
it's
graceful.
madness.
And what is happening? The power secretary is sitting there and is calling meetings to determine what to do. Now, I don't blame the poor guy. The thing is that he's a civil servant, an IAS officer, probably doesn't know a kilowatt from a megawatt, or probably he's learnt here,
So had to
They've
learn
told
very
him.
quickly.
How are you entrusting these big decisions to a person who's has to come and do his homework when he gets onto the job?
It just sums up what's wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're out of time. This is, as I said at the beginning of the program, just the first in a series of discussions. I think we're all agreed something needs to be done about the administration.